All right, y'all, we're gonna attempt to do this. I know you guys probably aren't able to read anything I put on the board that well, but that's okay. It's more just for me to make sure that I do everything I need to in this review video. I'm gonna probably break them up into the different chapters just to make them shorter so you guys can go back over the ones that you need to as you need to. So let's start. We're starting with the skeletal system. Got my skeleton here, okay? So when we talk about the skeletal system, remember we talked about shapes of bones. We had 4 bone shapes, okay? So we had flat bones, that's like in the skull. Remember the ribs were kind of a weird one, that's also a flat bone. Scapula is a flat bone, they usually are somewhat curved, okay? We had short bones, so that's like little ones in the hands and in the feet. We had irregular, those are mostly our vertebrae, which we'll talk about those in a little bit too. And then we had our long bones. This is our classic bone shape, right? So humerus up here, femur down here. They're longer than they are wide. Remember, the length of the long bone is known as the diaphysis. And then the ends are known as the epiphysis. In children, the length of the diaphysis has red bone marrow. In adults, it's yellow. And remember, red bone marrow is what produces blood cells. And then in adults, it's only in the epiphyses of the long bones that we still have red bone marrow to produce blood cells. Okay? Let's see here. We're gonna talk about the difference between the axial and the appendicular skeleton. So remember, axial skeleton is the skull, the vertebrae, and the rib cage. Okay? Everything else is appendicular. Okay? So the pelvic girdle, shoulder girdle, the clavicle is part of the shoulder girdle, so it is considered appendicular, not axial. Okay? When we're talking about the ribs, remember that ribs 1 through 7 are true ribs, which means that their cartilage connects directly to the sternum. And then the other ribs are false ribs, and the last 2 being floating ribs. Okay, so these little guys down here, floating ribs. Okay, let's look at this guy from the side. He doesn't have the best curves in his back, but remember that cervical curve should come back a little bit here. And then thoracic should be going this way. And then lumbar should be a lordosis again. And then we have the sacral kyphosis again, okay? Remember that thoracic and sacral curves are our primary curves. Because think of fetal position, right? Those can be your primary curves. And then we get our cervical curve when we start looking up. So this is why like tummy time is important for babies, right? We start looking up. And then when we start to crawl and walk, that gets this lumbar. So cervical and lumbar are secondary curves. Okay, and when we're talking about the vertebra, we're also gonna want to be able to identify where we're at, right? So remember, we have cervical, then and there's 7 cervical, then we have 12 thoracic, and that's what the ribs attach to. We have 5 lumbar. Sacrum is made up of 5 that are fused together, and then the coccyx is, they always say 2 to 4, fused together. Okay? Now, if you need to identify a certain vertebrae and what type of vertebrae it is, okay? So remember, cervical, they're little. They also have the extra little holes, extra foramen. They have transverse foramen. So this is the transverse process. They have transverse foramen. Here's the body, here's the spinous process. Okay, so on the transverse process, they have the transverse foramen, and that's where the vertebral artery goes through. So if you see something that's got extra holes, it's cervical. Okay, then let's look at thoracic. Remember, it's our giraffe. Okay, it's got a heart-shaped body. See my little heart? And this is where the ribs attach. So you have the extra little articulations where the ribs attach. And then we get lumbar. Remember, body is kidney shaped. And we get our moose. Now, I'm not gonna lie, for cervical, I say it kind of looks like Sid. Anybody else see it? You see Sid? Anyways, lumbar, big, kidney bean shaped at the bottom. Okay, we're good. Okay, a few more things. Skeletal. Pelvis. Remember, female pelvis is the iliac are gonna be wider, okay, to be flared out. In general, the bones are gonna be a little bit lighter. They're gonna be shallower. The ischial spines are gonna be further apart to allow for a wider outlet, okay? The pubic arch is gonna be wider to allow, because the angle of the pubic arch is gonna be greater, right? The sacrum is gonna be shorter and it's not gonna curve as much. So this actually looks like, to me, a female pelvis. Okay, so remember that. All right, so now we're gonna move on to some things that can happen with bones. Fractures, okay? So make sure you know your types of fractures. We have comminuted. That means it breaks into multiple pieces, okay? Then we get a compression fracture. That is where the bones are crushed. So that happens like in the spines, be like falls, crushes their bone. A depression fracture is where it gets pushed in. Okay, that happens commonly in the skull. Impacted is where the ends are forced together. Okay, remember that's like a foosh injury, so a fall or an outstretched hand, and then it jams the bones together. So impacted. A spiral fracture is known as a ragged break, and it has the twisting forces. That happens a lot in sports. And then green stick is an incomplete fracture, so that's where it only partially breaks, like a new green stick you find in spring. And this is common in kids because they have a lot more flexibility in their bones still, okay? Remember that after a fracture occurs, you're gonna get a hematoma first, so a bone bruise where there's gonna be blood that's in there and it's gonna swell. And then we're gonna have that callus, that fibrocartilage callus that's formed. Okay, and then over that fibrocartilage callus, there's going to be a bony callus on the bone. And then as that heals up, it'll eventually go away. So remember that the bony callus is going to be formed by osteoblasts. And then as that heals up, we'll send the osteoclasts afterwards to break down that extra bone and make the bone surface nice and smooth again. And then the bone should look like it did before the fracture. Don't know if you guys can see those at all, and they're probably backwards. So make sure you know your fractures. All right, guys, we're getting into muscles now. So I've got our nice little muscle model here. Remember that muscle cells, so each one of these is a muscle cell, also known as a muscle fiber, completely filled with those myofibrils, which actually creates the strength of the muscle, right? Because those are gonna contract. See, we've got the nice little light and dark bands. That's actually what's gonna contract and create the muscle movement, okay? Notice all the mitochondria in there because muscles need lots of energy, right? Remember that all those myofibrils push the nucleus to the outside of the muscle fiber. The membrane of a muscle cell is known as the sarcolemma. And then muscle cells also have that specialized rough endoplasmic reticulum known as the endoplasmic reticulum, and it stores calcium because remember a lot of stuff that muscles do requires calcium, okay? This is showing you the neuromuscular junction. I drew it up here too, so we'll talk about that in just a minute, okay? Remember that surrounding the muscle fiber is the endomysium, if you get a bunch of fibers together, that's known as a fascicle. They're covered by the perimysium, and then groups of fascicles are covered by the epimysium, and that's what makes up the whole muscle itself. Okay? Now, let's talk about the neuromuscular junction. And remember that the motor nerve that stimulates a certain set of muscle fibers, combined, that whole thing is known as a motor unit. Okay? And so what happens is at the end of this axon, so we've got a motor neuron, at the end of its axon is the axon terminal. Okay? At the end of the axon terminal, remember that's where vesicles of neurotransmitters are hanging out. Okay? If an action potential is sent down this axon, it will open calcium channels, and that is what will cause these vesicles to fuse and be released into the synaptic cleft. And then there are receptors on this muscle cell that will pick up the neurotransmitter, and that will stimulate the muscle fiber. Remember that muscle fibers are all or none, okay? They either fire or they don't. So that's the individual muscle fibers. You can't do part of a muscle fiber. But we do have a graded response in muscles where how many muscle fibers we stimulate controls how strong of a muscle contraction we get. So we can have lighter and stronger muscle contractions with that muscle. It just depends on how many motor units we recruit and how many fibers that we are stimulating at a given time. Okay, that's known as a graded response. All right, I kind of have it, our little chart out over here of an action potential. Okay, so remember that muscle cells are sitting at -70, -70, -70. And this is the same as the nerves. So when we talk about this with nerves and muscles, remember this is how electrical potentials get sent. So it doesn't matter what cell type we're talking about. Okay, so -70, if it gets stimulated enough, so here we're showing little stimulations that aren't enough, but if it gets stimulated enough, it's going to depolarize, it's going to cause an action potential to happen, then it will have to, and that will cause, and the muscle will cause a contraction, right? And then it has to repolarize and get to a point where it is back to that resting membrane potential. Okay, so if it gets stimulated enough to where it can create that depolarization event, that will trigger an active potential and it'll be propagated further on. Okay, so that was all the little stuff with muscles. Now we gotta talk about some of the big stuff with muscles. So make sure you know your actions. So rotation, right? I've got flexion and extension, and then I've got adduction and abduction, okay? So rotation is that rotation along the longitudinal axis, like in your head. This is done by the SCMs, okay? So they're gonna pull here on the mastoid, and when they pull, it's gonna create, so this one's pulling, okay? And it's gonna create rotation of the head, okay? Flexion and extension. So in the arms, think of like the elbows, right? So flexion is decreasing that angle, extension is increasing that angle. For the elbows, flexion is going to be the biceps and extension is going to be the triceps. Okay? Then in the lower limb it gets a little bit more confusing because things that flex the hip will extend the knee, and things that extend the hip will flex the knee. Okay? So if we flex the hip and extend the knee, that's going to be this muscle right here. That's your quadriceps. Okay? And if we are extending and flexing, or extending the hip and flexing the knee, that is going to be in the back. That's going to be your hamstrings. For abduction and adduction, remember this is not one letter away, but if you get abducted, you get taken away. So that is going away. So my arm going away, my leg going away, okay? Abduction, okay? In the arm, abduction is achieved with the deltoid, okay? In the leg, it's mostly glute med. And then if we want to bring it back across, for the arm, that's going to be your pectoral muscle. And for your legs, they're actually just called the adductors. So that's a really nice one. They are really nice about that. So know your muscle actions and know what the action means. Okay, we're moving on to the nervous system. So first, let's talk about glial cells. So remember, the nervous system has neurons, and then everything else, all the supporting cells, are known as glial cells. So let's talk about some of those. So first we have the astrocytes. Remember, those are star-shaped. They wrap around the capillaries and bind the neurons to the capillaries in the brain. And they are going to be what creates the blood-brain barrier. Remember that very non-permeable capillaries that don't allow a lot of stuff to get in so that nothing bad happens to our neurons in our brain. Okay, then we have our microglia that are they are the phagocytes in the brain. Remember, they're going to eat up anything that shouldn't be there. Then we have the ependymal cells. They're going to line like the ventricles and stuff, and they are ciliated so that they can move the cerebrospinal fluid around the brain and around the central nervous system. And then we have the oligodendrocytes. They are what create the myelin in the central nervous system. Okay? And then we have the Schwann cells. Those create the myelin in the peripheral nervous system. And then the satellite cells are there to protect and cushion in the peripheral nervous system. Okay. Here's the fun stuff. We've got our brain here, right? We've got the longitudinal fissure that divides left and right halves. We've got the frontal lobe. Remember, that's higher functioning. Now, the very posterior aspect of it, that is motor cortex. Then when we move further back, we get the parietal lobes, right? And the very anterior portion of the parietal lobe is the primary sensory cortex, right? The temporal lobes on the sides are for hearing and balance. And then in the back, the occipital lobe, that's for vision. I'm gonna open this guy up, and then we've got our cerebellums on the bottom. Remember, those are for coordinated movements, so they're gonna be really important for things like balance. Okay, opening this guy up. Now, it's kind of hard to see. It's really more inside here that we've got the ventricles, but remember, we have a lateral ventricle on each side. Then we have a third ventricle. This is our cerebral aqueduct down to the fourth ventricle, and then the cerebrospinal fluid will run into the center of the spinal cord, central canal of the spinal cord. Okay? We've got the corpus callosum. Remember, that's the commissure. So that is the connecting tract that goes between the two hemispheres. That's the one they'll cut if they need to, if seizures are crossing between the two hemispheres of the brain. We've got the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. Remember that the hypothalamus is the last part of the brain to develop, right? So the thalamus is the last part, or the hypothalamus is the last part, and it is really important for things like temperature control and thirst. It also is going to be what regulates, which we'll learn about this in chapter 9, but it regulates this pituitary gland, which honestly, is it on here? Oh, it's on the other half. There's our little dangly pituitary gland, okay? Okay, then moving down, we have the midbrain, we have the pons, and then we have the medulla oblongata, which is going to turn into the spinal cord. Okay, a few other things to remember. Remember that in the epithalamus, the roof of the epithalamus, because of it's where the third ventricle is, we also have what's known as the choroid plexus. Remember that each ventricle has a choroid plexus, and that's where cerebrospinal fluid is formed. And then also remember that in the spinal cord, or in the brainstem, we have that very interesting reticular formation that's just like that loose network of neurons that create the reticular activating system that has to do with our sleep-wake cycle. Okay, so that has to do with consciousness. That's what decides what should be brought to your level of consciousness, what is important to bring to kind of the prefrontal cortex and make us think about it, okay? The body's getting lots of information all the time. It doesn't always think it's that important to tell us about it. All right, here is our cross-section of our spinal cord, okay? Central gray matter, surrounded by white matter. Remember, the white matter means that it's myelinated. Gray matter is unmyelinated in cell bodies. Now, if you're here, we're going to say just unmyelinated tracts, okay? Then we have our ventral roots coming off the ventral aspect. We have the dorsal root coming off the dorsal aspect, and there is your dorsal root ganglion. Remember, a ganglion is cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. So now that it's come off of the spinal cord, it is now considered peripheral nervous system, okay? Now, the dorsal and the ventral roots combine together, and they're going to form the spinal nerve. So the spinal nerve is a mixed nerve, and that's what comes out of the intervertebral foramen between your vertebrae. So the holes between the vertebrae, this is where the spinal nerves come out. And then there we've got our central canal that's going to be filled with cerebrospinal fluid. All right, make sure you know about the autonomic nervous system. Remember, that's broken down into parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions. The sympathetic division uses adrenergic, so adrenaline neurotransmitters, and it's going to amp your body up. So this is when the bear is chasing you. This is when you have to take your test. This is when you're anxious about something, okay? It's going to increase your heart rate, increase your blood pressure, dilate your pupils, dilate your blood vessels. It's going to get you ready for action, okay? And then you've got the parasympathetic division, which uses cholinergic neurotransmitters, okay? And it's to bring you down. It's the rest and digest. So it's when nothing's going on and we can just bring our heart rate down. We can activate the smooth muscle of the intestines to digest food. Okay, so make sure you know your divisions of the autonomic nervous system. And then lastly for this section, we're going to talk about the cranial nerves. Okay, so cranial nerve 1 is olfaction. It's for your sense of smell. Cranial nerve 2 is ocular, and it's for vision. Cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6, so oculomotor, that one's nice. It's named for what it does. It's motor for the eyes. Trochlear is also motor for the eyes, that's 4. And then 6 is abducens, and it is also eye muscles. Okay, so there's 3 that are for eye muscles. The one we skipped in between, 5, is trigeminal. And trigeminal is for the skin of the face, sensory for the skin of the face, and then muscles of mastication. That means muscles for chewing. Then we get facial, it's number 7. It's for muscles of facial expression, and it's also involved in taste. Vestibular cochlear is for hearing and balance. That's number 8. Number 9 is glossopharyngeal. It's for swallowing. It is also involved in taste, and then it's also for those pressure receptors in the carotid artery. 10 is vagus, and it supplies motor control to your visceral organs, and it also supplies parasympathetic to those visceral organs. 11 is accessory, and it is for your neck muscles. And then hypoglossal is for the tongue as well. Okay, so those are some nice ones to just, some nice ones you can look at and make sure that you know. So that's review for chapter 7. Okay, so I already have a video for chapter 8, like a chapter 8 lecture video up. So absolutely make sure that you guys look at that. But I wanted to do at least the ear model for chapter 8, just so you guys get the visual of it, okay? So here's the pinna, right? And then this is gonna be your external acoustic meatus, right? And it's going through the temporal bone, okay? This is your external ear. The external ear ends at the tympanic membrane, okay? This is your tympanic membrane, or your eardrum. Then we get the ossicles. Those are the 3 little bones in the middle ear. Also, the middle ear is connected to your throat with the eustachian tube or the pharyngotympanic tube, okay? This is what equalizes pressure. So this is when you go up in a plane or you go somewhere where there's mountains and you have those pressure changes. That's because of this. So then you go and you pinch your nose and you do like a Valsalva maneuver and you equalize the pressure in your ears. You feel your ears pop. That's what's actually causing that to happen, okay? And then these are gonna push onto the oval window. So this little guy, our poor little stirrup is broken here, but he's pushing on the oval window, which that will then go into the middle ear. And then this is the cochlea. And then here we got vestibular cochlear nerve. So the cochlea will be for hearing. And then remember also in the middle ear, we have got these semicircular canals that are for dynamic equilibrium, okay? So that was just a really quick version of the ear. And like notice that almost all of this is inside of the temporal bone, okay? But external ear, middle ear, inner ear.